Hey there, and thanks for tuning into this month's episode of the Fraternus Forge podcast. This is a forum for young adult Catholic men and women to come together in conversation on topics of faith and morality, for as iron sharpens iron, so one man or woman sharpens another. Really excited that you're here with us this month. Happy Valentine's Day and happy Ash Wednesday as well. Interesting coincidence that those two landed on the same day this year. Roses are dead, violets are blue. Okay, Matt, enough with the cheesy jokes. Our guest this month is Rachel Hoover Canto. Rachel's been a member of our young adult Catholic community here in Nashville for the past couple of years, most notably as the founder and president, for lack of a better word, of the Sacred Heart Singles Ministry. She organized a couple of mixers and a couple of speed dating events for folks in the Nashville area who are discerning marriage. She's also an author and has a book coming out later this month called Pretty Good Catholic: How to Find, Date, and Marry Someone Who Shares Your Values. It's a beautiful book. We get into a lot of what she covers in that book in this conversation, just giving you the Cliff Notes version. What are some of the challenges that millennials and Gen Zers are facing compared to the challenges that our parents faced? And then pacing in dating. When is it appropriate to move from non-exclusive to exclusive, etc.? Being present to the person that's in front of us, being able to set aside the checklist and our hopes and aspirations for who we want our spouse to be, and just be present to the real human, the image of Christ that's in front of us. We talk a little bit about communication and honesty, being transparent at every step in the process, even if it's awkward. And then we also just come back on a really hopeful note at the end of it, that marriage is a blessing and dating is a blessing. And regardless of the ups and downs that we encounter along the way, it is truly a gift from God to be able to share even a small part of our lives with somebody special. So I think that's a transformative note for all of us to end on. So definitely want to encourage you to pick up a copy of Rachel's book. There's a link to pre-order that in the description of this episode. So go to Spotify, Apple Music, Google Podcasts, whatever you listen to this on, and make sure that you get your copy today. I know I am going to be getting mine as well. Rachel will also be signing copies of this book on Saturday, February 24th at St. Mary's Bookstore next to Cathedral in downtown Nashville, if you know where that is. So definitely mark that on your calendars as well. That is it. Really glad that you're here with us. Thanks for tuning in. Let's jump into it.
So it kind of starts a couple of years ago. I had decided to go down to part-time at my regular job so I could pursue more freelance writing, and was writing on a bunch of different topics, mostly for Catholic outlets. And at the same time was kind of going through my season of singleness and wishing I wasn't still in it. And, you know, I was as a little girl, someone who really always wanted to get married and be a mom, and thought that was something that just easily, naturally happened when you grew up, and didn't think that there were a lot of difficulties to getting there. And so being even like mid-20s and nowhere near married was just getting more and more disappointing. And so I started to look around and realized that I wasn't the only one facing this problem. Originally, sometimes the feeling is, what's wrong with me? And then I looked around and said, well, what's wrong with this whole Catholic dating culture? Because it's not just me running into this difficulty of, going years on end sometimes without going on a date at all, and then getting into some relationship that turns out to be really unhealthy or difficult to navigate, and then breakups, and then having to heal from that breakup, and then starting all over again, just over and over. And should I go online? Should I not? Can't you just meet somebody organically in person these days? And all of those questions. So I was living through all of that, seeing my brothers and my friends also kind of living through it, and realizing this is a bigger problem than just my own life. And so wrote a couple of articles exploring that topic primarily for Catholic World Report about a year ago, just to try to get a conversation started. And I had taken an anonymous survey and talked to a bunch of people, and just tried to kind of get more perspectives besides just my own, and confirm like these really are problems that the Catholic world is facing. I mean, the culture broadly is facing a lot of issues with relationships. Obviously, we see that marriage rates are way down just overall, and there's a ton of reasons for that. But specifically within the Catholic world, maybe we deal a little less with some of the challenges that the secular world faces. Like, if you're a Catholic who believes that marriage is really important to begin with, maybe you're more likely to get married. Whereas if marriage is just a piece of paper the government gives you, you're less likely to pursue it, right?
Right.
But even for Catholics, there are a lot of the same issues that the secular world is facing, plus some kind of unique struggles that I was running into, like people struggling to discern whether they're even called to marriage in the first place or whether they're called to priesthood or religious life. That's a whole layer of this that not everyone else faces. It's kind of a uniquely Catholic thing. So I kept finding more and more difficulties that people are facing, more and more obstacles, whether it was something I'd run into myself or not, and kind of compiled a few of the main ones into an article and, quoted other people to say, like, this is why younger Catholics just aren't getting married like they used to. And I want especially people who are older, who are already married, to understand the struggles, because sometimes they tend to oversimplify the problem. Well-meaning advice sometimes, but they're oversimplifying the problem. Sometimes they're saying something like, well, people aren't getting married because they're just cohabiting instead, or people aren't getting married because they're afraid of commitment, or, it's just one simple issue to some people's minds. And I found that that's just not the case. There are so many different issues that are all layered on top of each other. So started to write on that. Sorry if I'm getting a little off topic with your answer, but
this is great.
So writing the articles, they really took off, got a lot of attention. Clearly people were very interested in this topic, and that sparked, more and more conversations with more people about even more issues that I maybe wasn't as focused on initially, and it just grew and grew. And ultimately, an editor at Vianney Vocations reached out to me and said, I saw your article and this topic is great and deserves a whole book, because they published some other books about discerning priesthood and religious life and realized they really needed to balance it out and publish a book on discerning marriage as well, because all the vocations are important and all of them are suffering and struggling right now.
Yeah. The fact that they only had books for priesthood and religious life, I think, is a little telling in terms of how Catholics, and I would say the culture at large, think about marriage, where it's just sort of assumed that, oh, hey, yeah, you grow up and then you just marry somebody. You know what I mean?
Right. I think there's sort of two different ways you can look at this, maybe two different issues that are somehow happening simultaneously. There's a sense in which marriage is built into our nature by God. And I do touch on this in the book, that even the Catechism says that the vocation to marriage, that's the phrase it uses, the vocation to marriage is written in the very nature of man and woman. So in some sense, you could argue that we all have a default vocation to marriage, and that if you're called to something else, that's a little bit of an exception, but it's a calling either way. And some people just have this supernatural calling that kind of overrides the natural calling. Yep. If you think about it that way, that means everyone kind of should at least start considering that they're called to marriage, early on. And if they don't have any sense they're called to religious life, then like marriage is probably
where they should
be. Where they should be at least starting to head, until God directs them otherwise, right? But on the other hand, everybody should be open to that supernatural calling in case that is your calling, right? And we don't want to overemphasize marriage at the expense of the other vocations. And so I think sometimes people just assume everybody's getting married and forget that priesthood and religious life are even an option. And then on the other hand, some people act like you have to like really, really start from a completely neutral blank slate and like thoroughly discern all these options for yourself. And even if you had no real sense of a calling, as if you have to go and sort of puzzle it out yourself and not just go with what feels right, And so I think there's sort of this like under discernment that some people go through, and then some over discernment that people go through. That's my suspicion. I'm not an expert theologian in this topic, but I think it's good to be open to both options, but also to remember that God does give us free will for a reason. And so if you are kind of exploring and, genuinely open to God's will, and you don't have any bolts from the blue and you just really, really want one or the other, you should probably just walk that direction and not overthink it too much. Yeah. And, if God really wants you to do something else, he's going to communicate to you in a way that you can understand.
Yeah, that's huge. That last piece in particular, where it's, yes, desire is a really important component. And yes, like we should learn about each of these vocations. Like, hey, what does it take? Like, what's the sacrifice involved and all that? But then at the end of the day, it should, like, I've heard someone say this before, that there should be peace moving in that direction, or at least like the desire of this is what I want, and then like you said, trusting God to sort of handle those redirections as needed. Now, I think that's a good segue into the issues that you mentioned earlier, where folks are gonna experience disappointment. Like, it's just the nature of the world that we live in. And I feel like sometimes those disappointments can be taken as, maybe this isn't for me at all. Like, maybe this vocation, this thing that I want isn't meant for me. It's for somebody else, but not me. What other sorts of issues, or like, what sorts of challenges did you encounter in doing your research for this book and having those conversations?
I like to lay it out as kind of the stages of the process, from being totally single to being married, and just show that there are hurdles at every stage that I ran into. So people who are totally single and unattached, besides the whole issue of how to discern their vocation to begin with, if they're trying to step toward marriage, often they just run into a lot of difficulty meeting other single people to begin with, especially single Catholics or single Christians, single people that they would actually be interested in. I talk to a lot of people who maybe live in a smaller town or just a less Catholic area, who say, there are just no people my age at church. I don't have anybody to talk to. In Nashville, or a city like this where there's a really thriving young adult community, that might not be so much the issue. But then I spoke to a lot of people who said, I meet people, but I can't tell if they're interested. I can't tell if I'm showing my interest in the right way. We just kind of don't know what to do or how to signal. We've lost this language of like appropriate flirtation and kind of that subtle dance between male and female a little bit. And so that was a huge issue. There were some ladies who would say, I keep running into the same guy at all these events. We keep having great conversations, but he just never makes a move. He never does anything. And then there are guys who are like, I can't tell if a girl is being friendly or being flirtatious. I can't, like, if I'm scared to ask her out because she might be like angry and be like, no, we're just friends, And there's a lot of risk too. This is something interesting I heard from men, that it feels very risky to ask a woman out too soon, because especially if you're in kind of a close-knit Catholic community where everybody kind of knows each other, because if you ask her out and then she says no, she's going to go talk to all her friends about it. And then they all know that you got rejected. And if you ask another one of her friends out, even one guy told me even years later, he felt like he couldn't ask any of her friends out because he would get a reputation for being like that guy who asks everybody out or something. And so there's a lot of, I think unique difficulties with just being in kind of a tighter knit community where everybody's connected, and not knowing what the etiquette is around talking about the dates you've been on, or the people you said no to, or who you're interested in, or whatever. And so there's a lot of obstacles with just the initial stage of meeting people, getting to that first date, and then getting from there into a more serious relationship. One of the main things that came up there was, what is the difference between giving someone a chance and leading someone on? Women especially seem to be, men too though, seem to be very, very, very fearful of the accusation of having led someone on or of hurting someone. And there's this sense that if you go on even a couple of dates with someone and then you end it, you're probably like breaking their heart and devastating them. Or at least there's this fear that you're really hurting someone by calling it off after just a little while, or that getting into a relationship and then ending it is like one of the worst possible things you could do, because now you've led someone on for however long. And a lot of fear, not only of having our own hearts broken, I think, is what I was hearing from people. They're saying, I don't just fear having my own heart broken or being hurt or disappointed in some way myself. I fear hurting someone else. And I don't know how to avoid hurting someone else and yet also give someone a chance. So that I think is, a very deep kind of a cultural, it's like a subtle cultural thing in the Catholic and Christian world, that quote unquote leading someone on is one of the worst sins you could ever possibly commit. And that if you cause someone any emotional pain in the romantic sphere, that makes you like a terrible person somehow, rather than just accepting it as part of how it goes sometimes. And maybe, I also think there are some ways we can approach relationships that might somewhat mitigate that issue, but eventually, the risk of disappointment and pain is just part of love, right? So getting over that fear, I think, is a big obstacle. And then I think discernment comes back up again later in the relationship, in the sense that it's a discernment whether or not you're going to marry this person and whether or not it's time to get engaged. How long do you date before you get engaged? Do you and the other person have the same expectations about that? Have you had conversations about it? Then there's a lot of things regarding just how the day-to-day of a relationship goes. You know, how often are you supposed to be seeing each other? How often are you texting? What types of dates are acceptable at what stage? What level of physical affection is acceptable at what stage? What's, you know, violating chastity and what's not? There's honestly a lot of different opinions on that sometimes. So I think there's a lot of questions swirling there, where two people can get into a relationship and not even know how different their perspectives are on these topics until they run up against it in kind of an awkward way. So just the ability to have really good, open, honest communication about all those big, tough, heavy things is difficult, you know, but it's necessary, because we don't have a culture where everybody kind of comes from the same background and kind of has the same values and expectations. We have to start from scratch with, you know, talking explicitly and openly and honestly about absolutely everything, which can get kind of exhausting, honestly, but it's necessary today. Yeah, so that's kind of, I would say, getting all the way up to the engagement stage. There can still be these big obstacles, just because everybody, I heard someone put it this way: we all kind of make up our own rules for dating, but we all think that our rules are the real ones or the right ones somehow. Yeah. And so it can be a lot of shock when you run into somebody else who thinks, you know, somebody could think you should be able to decide if you're getting engaged within 6 months, and somebody else is like, no, I need at least 2 years. And it's like vastly different expectations.
This is my timeline. This is your timeline.
Right. Right.
I feel like there's generational differences when it comes to dating and relationships. Like the era that our parents grew up in versus the era that we're growing up in, and what are some of the biggest differences that are contributing to the sort of dynamic shift that we're experiencing?
Two big things come to mind. Maybe you can tell me which one would be more interesting to dive into for this audience. But number one, really obviously, online dating is a thing now, and it wasn't for our parents.
Yep.
And that is a whole new frontier of trying to figure out etiquette and just how to navigate things. And how do you even tell if you're interested in someone based on an online profile or not? Is it leading someone on to ask to meet up? Should you do a phone call first to make sure it's not going to be a waste of time to meet up in person?
Right.
We should also talk about the phrase waste of time and how that comes up in dating as a separate topic later if we have time.
This is great.
But yeah, so I think online dating is a huge one. And then also, I was pretty interested to find that talking to my parents, grandparents, anybody over, 50-ish had a very different idea of how the earliest stage of a relationship can proceed. So this idea of being able to go out with more than one person, not just for like a week, but for perhaps a few months, and being open to just what people now would call dating around. Sometimes it has a negative connotation, but a lot of people back then, that was totally normal until you decided to have this explicit conversation and go, you know what, I think there's a lot of potential here. Let's get into a more serious relationship and actually discern marriage just with each other. So that's really interesting. And that gets spicy conversations going when I talk to people about it. Some people are very in favor of kind of trying to revive that and say, it's okay to date non-exclusively for a while. If you happen to be interested in more than one person, there shouldn't be anything wrong with that. And then other people say, that makes no sense. That sounds terrible. Why would you ever do that? And so, I don't know if we want to get controversial with some things. I have some thoughts there.
I'm all about controversy. Let's stir the pot.
Sure.
So there's the two mindsets that you're talking about. There's one person at a time, which I believe I've heard called serial dating.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
okay,
serial dating, like one
phrase.
person at a time, discern with this one person at a time.
Right.
Or there's the other model, which I believe, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe it goes something like, I am going on dates with maybe 2 or 3 people at the same time, and then once I've hit a point where I want to be exclusive with somebody, then if I'm being a good human, go to those other 2 people and say, hey, listen, I really appreciate the time. I'm going to go in this direction, and then go from there.
Yeah, you could almost think of it as kind of having a funnel. This is the image I use in the book, actually. You can think of it as having a funnel of like all the people you've met, and then maybe several of those people you're somewhat interested in. So you're going to pursue it a little bit, just getting to know them a little bit more, and then allow it to sort of naturally taper down to a point where you're like, all right, I really feel, a sense of calling to like pursue this relationship further with just one person versus, I think the other approach of like, you just kind of that expectation, like once you've gone on like maybe 3 to 5 dates, you're either going to be exclusive and like really all in, or you're going to be, it's over. It seems like it gets just much more serious one way or the other pretty quickly. And even during those 3 to 5 dates, you might be just focused on that one person, even if you're not calling each other boyfriend and girlfriend. I think that seems much more the norm, I think, for our generation, at least among Catholics that I've encountered. That's the default. That's the expectation, is that you're going to do it that way. But someone pointed out to me, this ties in with online dating as well. If you're on a dating app, you're probably messaging a couple of people at a time for a little while, and nobody seems to think that's strange at all. But for some reason in person, if you're quote unquote talking to even more than one person, sometimes that has this kind of icky feeling, like why would you do that? And I think it also ties in with the idea of like leading people on. There's a sense that like, well, you can't really be interested in more than one person. You're leading somebody on if you're doing that. But I would argue, I think you actually can be at least somewhat interested in more than one person. You don't have to have, I'm not talking about being like madly in love with 2 different people like that. There's something's wrong there. But I'm talking about when you're in that early phase of like, especially if you're post-college, you're say a young professional, probably the only way you really get to know somebody is by deciding to set up a date and spend some time with them. I think it's strange in that situation to go from practically strangers to we are actively discerning marriage with only each other in just a couple weeks. I think I see a perhaps healthier model of dating as a little closer to how a friendship would happen organically, where you meet somebody, something about them sparks your interest. Maybe it's not like an extreme attraction or something, not super romantic from the beginning, but you're like, there's something here. I would like to talk to this person more. So that's enough to go on a first date with somebody. And then if it goes well, then you go on a second and just kind of take it one step at a time for a while. And just like you can have more than one acquaintance that you're kind of developing into a friendship at the same time, you can have more than one acquaintance that you're kind of nurturing into a friendship that might become a romance at the same time. There's kind of this friendship level that you have to build with someone, whether you do it by going on dates or not, right? Before you can get to this point where you're like actively considering marrying them and spending the rest of your life with them, So I think sometimes Catholics in an effort to be very intentional and to date for marriage and all that good stuff, kind of just skip over the part where your acquaintances just getting to know each other and jump straight into this like really serious phase. And I just think that shouldn't be necessary. I think maybe occasionally it just happens to happen. You really hit it off with someone and that's great. And if it all goes well, then wonderful. But I don't think people should feel forced into that. I feel that people should feel free to give themselves a little bit more time to intentionally discern whether they're getting into an exclusive relationship with this person and maybe they're not actually going on dates with anybody else at the same time, or maybe they are. It doesn't really matter. It's just whatever happens to happen. But that sense of taking it one step at a time and not being super committed from the beginning, I think is really important. And a lot of experts that I talked to for the book, professional matchmakers, dating coaches, just other people in the Christian and Catholic world who are experienced in this, recommended doing that. They highly recommend this kind of non-exclusive phase where you're maybe open to more than one person, or at least just taking it one date at a time, no real commitment. For usually the consensus was like that should be 2 to 3 months from meeting somebody to getting into a serious relationship, should be at least 2 to 3 months, which I think a lot of people feel like that's super long. But I think it makes sense. It takes at least 90 days or so to know that someone really is who they say they are, and that there really is potential there. And I think that would maybe save people from some of the possibly unnecessary, like big heartbreaks, because if you get really serious with someone really quickly, and you're super committed, and then it ends, that feels a lot worse than just, we were going on some dates for a while and then it ended, even if it took the same amount of time, right? So, sorry if I'm being a little unclear with that, but I think...
No.
Yeah.
I've heard something similar. So I've had a life coach like a year or two ago,
nice.
Something through work, and I would bring examples of, hey, here's what I'm encountering on like the day-to-day and like the dating relationship space. And she would always encourage me, especially like, do you know the book Attached, like the anxious and avoidant attachment styles and all that?
I've heard of the attachment styles, not the book, but
it's dictated by what each type does under stress. So anxious under stress is going to try to reach out and like fix whatever's wrong. Secure ideally is able to say like, this is what I need, and like I would like this. They're much more balanced. But then avoidant is like, nothing's wrong. There's not a problem. I'm under stress, but nothing's wrong. And so coming from an anxious perspective, which is mine, my life coach would say the same thing. Like, hey, listen, so you don't get too far down the path and put too much pressure, I think is a key word here as well, on one relationship to be something that it's not necessarily ready to be.
Right.
If you date multiple people at the same time, you're able to relax more and be yourself more instead of just putting all of your eggs into one basket. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yes, exactly. I would say, again, I don't want to make it sound like everybody has to go out there and make sure they find 3 different people to date, because if you're forcing it, then there is something maybe a little sleazy about that. But
right.
I think being open to it, and like you said, just pursuing a little bit any connection that seems like it might have potential, but then not forcing any of them to become like the one lifeline you have or something to potentially getting married. I found this through experience myself. I'm luckily very happily married for about a month now. But when I was running the local Catholic singles ministries, speed dating events and everything, and learning more about this whole topic and talking to some of these experts that I'm mentioning, I decided I was going to be basically just challenge myself, like be open to pretty much anybody who asked me out for at least like 3 solid months, and just, unless I had a specific reason not to. So more like ruling people out as opposed to like ruling people in. And I was similarly someone who would get kind of anxious and overly attached quickly. But when I just kind of sat back and said, I'm kind of open to whatever, I'm going to let God kind of show me through the day-to-day experience of this, which direction I need to go, whether I need to end something or not. I felt a lot more relaxed, a lot more free. Dating was a lot more fun because it wasn't on me to like make sure I preserved this one connection that maybe was kind of on the rocks. It was, or out of a sense of scarcity. I think that's what it is. I tended to cling to things out of a sense of scarcity. Like, well, I found this guy who seems great, and I just can't imagine that there's anybody else like him out there, and I just can't imagine anything better. So I just have to like force this to work, even though it's not working. And that had been some of my past experience. And so switching to really just trusting in God more and manifesting that trust through just taking everything one step at a time and going, you know what, for today, I get to spend time in front of this one person. And while I was on the date, I think this is important too. While I was on a date, I would always try to just focus on the person in front of me. I wasn't like actively comparing him to somebody else or anything like that. It was just, I'm going to just spend some time with this other human being who's an image of God. And this is a gift to get to spend time with this other human being. And then afterward, maybe tomorrow, like go to adoration or just sit with a journal and sort of reflect and go, all right, what was my gut telling me? What did I notice in the conversation? What did I learn about him? And, now I'll think about whether there's still question marks. Is this something I want to pursue one step further? Or do I already have enough information to go, we're really not going to be a good fit, in which case the right thing to do is just decline to go out again, So it was kind of letting go and being in the moment, and then also taking some time to reflect kind of separately. I don't know if that kind of helps answer the question, but
it totally does. Yeah, I think a couple of words that you touched on there, and I feel like this ties in especially well to the generation that we're in, millennials and then Gen Zers as well. I read an article, this is on the topic of scarcity. So I read an article not too long ago that sort of talked about how the internet and comparison and the whole social media thing, which I'm sure folks are familiar with, where you're seeing somebody else's shiny outsides in your maybe not so great day-to-day life, or your good day-to-day life that seems dull by comparison. Plus, like movies and music and media and all that stuff contribute to this scarcity mindset where everybody is thinking that love is so important and marriage and connection with that other person is so important, and I'm not going to be fixed or whole until I get that thing. And so I could see where if you meet somebody who maybe, and I like that you included checklist in your description of the book, which we'll get to.
Yes.
But if you are holding on to that checklist and you meet somebody who hits some of the big ones, and it's been weeks or months or years of this sort of landscape that we're in, then I could see how a lot of pressure could get put on that situation, as opposed to what you're saying, hey, I'm going to just be open and bring God into the equation too. I love that you brought, hey, I'm going to sit here and think and journal about this with the Lord, this experience that I had yesterday evening or whenever with this person. God, what do you think about this? What was my gut genuinely telling me here? Where should I go next? I think that's huge.
Right. And if you're just doing all the things you can do to meet lots of great people in general and having healthy friendships and everything else, and, then yeah, there's no need to feel like, well, if I end this one connection, then I won't be able to find anybody else. I think it's really important to start off this journey with having a really good, just a healthy social life and getting out there. And maybe, if you are doing online dating, that's great, but also do plenty of in-person things that will help you meet new people, whether it turns into friendships or dating or whatever. It just, having a healthy balance in your life in general will probably lead to more balance in the dating sphere and kind of steer you away from that scarcity mindset. That's definitely what I found. Sometimes clinging to a relationship that's not working is something that happens out of loneliness and not out of, it's not good discernment. You need other people around you, and you need a sense of freedom in your discernment, or it's not going to work well.
Like if you don't have healthy platonic relationships and you're not getting enough sleep or not eating well or exercising or not spending enough time in prayer,
you can get a really skewed sense of how many people are out there too for dating purposes or for friendship, for anything, So if you're consistently doing things that bring you into new social circles and help you meet new people, then all right, if this relationship isn't the one for me, I know God has some other plan for me, and I know that he's going to bring me, to meet someone else, maybe even next week. It could be so soon, somebody else could be right around the corner. That could go to an extreme. People could get to a point where they're avoiding commitment by just going, but there might be somebody better, and that would be a problem. But I think so often what I've run into was people who just didn't have a great sense of God's generosity ultimately, because they were clinging to a relationship that was the best one they had ever seen or the best one they could imagine for themselves, but wasn't actually that good, And so, just openness to everybody that God's putting in your path, and just taking everything day by day and trusting in him to bring new people into your path if the current person is not right, I think that's very important.
Yeah, I went to confession at Cathedral with Father Bolster recently, and just one thing that he said sort of stood out to me. He was like, "Do you really believe that God loves you?" And I feel like that might be at the root of some of what you're describing. He followed it up with a couple of really cool questions, and one I like in particular is, do you think that if you went on a road trip with God that he would be pumped about that?
Ooh.
Do you think he would be really excited to spend that time with you? And I feel like if the answer is no, he encouraged me to bring it to prayer. And for me, for a little while, the answer was no, where it's I'm kind of a head case, God. I don't think you want to be on a road trip with me. And I feel like that's something that requires healing and time, and it can be rooted in shame. It can be rooted in other experiences from childhood or disappointments in this landscape that we're in. But if it comes down to a lack of confidence in God's goodness, like you're saying, I could see how people would, especially control freaks, which I am a recovering control freak, would want to reach out and grab onto something and be like, well, if you're not gonna give me this thing that I want, then I got to do it. And this is as good as it's going to get. So I'm going to hang on to this when I really shouldn't be. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Right. Yeah. I think so often he tries to kind of pry something out of our hands because he has something so much better and ultimately so much easier in mind for us. Enrique and I were just talking last night about sometimes we, as humans, like to almost go out of our way to pick up different crosses than he intended for us, or heavier ones. And especially in relationships, sometimes we're like, but I love this person and I'm just going to take all the crosses that they're trying to bear. And maybe we're just not cut out for that. Maybe we're not called to that. Maybe we're called to love that person with a more just charity from a distance and not be super involved in their life. And that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's this whole idea of like wasting time or like treating interactions with people as if they're a waste of time. Mm-hmm. Like I could see what you're describing, where someone is so attached to a relationship that they're willing to ignore all of the stuff that might be going wrong with it, or all of the crosses associated with that they're really not supposed to be picking up. But then I could also see like the inverse of that. So that I would call a hyper focus on the good. Mm-hmm. Versus like, I imagine a waste of time type attitude would be a hyper focus on the negative. Could you say a little bit more about like your stance in that space?
Sure. I think what kind of sparked a lot of thoughts on this for me as I was writing the book, interviewing people, talking to people, was I tended to hear people say things like, especially if they were thinking about doing this kind of non-exclusive phase of dating, they might think, well, that sounds like a waste of time. I want to get to getting married as quick as possible or something like that. Or just, if someone expresses interest and the other person thinks, well, they don't check like these one or two boxes that I have on my list. So I think I'd be wasting their time to go out with them. So there's kind of fear of wasting one's own time, fear of wasting the other person's time, similar to that fear of leading someone on or being led on. I think it's kind of almost different ways of phrasing the same thing. But what kind of hit me as I was writing, because sometimes as I write to think things out, and then I go back and rewrite it so it actually makes sense. But there's a section in the book I was writing, and I realized, okay, we know that objectifying people is bad. As Catholics, we're taught that, a person is a person. We shouldn't treat them as an object, right?
Yep.
And usually we talk about that in the context of treating someone as a physical object, a sexual object, right? There's objectifying someone in that way, in kind of the realm of lust. But I really think there's a way of objectifying people sort of intellectually, for lack of a better word, and looking at someone and saying, all right, I have my checklist of what I want in a future spouse. I have my job description, so to speak. And this person doesn't fulfill all my criteria, so they're not good spouse material for me, and just sort of rejecting them in that way. Mm-hmm. Or looking at someone and saying, they check all my boxes, perfect fit for my job description, perfect spouse material. I'm just going to sort of plow forward and like make this work. And I think either way, that's a form of objectification, to look at someone solely as, are they spouse material for me or not? I mean, even the word material, you're talking about someone as matter, like they're an object, right? And I get that spouse material can be kind of a lighthearted phrase, like, nothing wrong with using it in the right way. But I just started to think more and more about that. Like, I hear people say things like, he or she is not what I'm looking for. You're saying the word what instead of who, like there's so many ways in which I think we subtly kind of objectify someone. And so I think we need to guard against that just in charity. As Christians, I think it's so important to strike this balance between telling someone honestly if you don't think it's a good fit, you don't see yourself pursuing the relationship further. You definitely shouldn't drag it out unnecessarily when you know already that your answer is no, right? Mm-hmm. That would be leading someone on. But as do you know of Christina Pineda? She's the matchmaker who lives here in town.
I think I have met her, yes.
Okay. Yeah, she's wonderful. I interviewed her for the book and kind of got a lot of her takes, and she's been very influential on my dating mindset, honestly, just kind of informally, which is wonderful. But she says that as long as you still have a question mark in your mind, then you're not leading someone on. You're just still getting to know them better. You're still gathering information, And so that's where the line is really. If you don't have a question mark and the answer is no, then don't lead the person on. But if you're still like, I'm not sure, then it's okay to remain open and continue a little further. And even if it doesn't work out after 1 date, 3 dates, 3 months, 6 months, however long it is, if it doesn't work out, I think we should resist the temptation to look back and say, that was a waste of time. Because for one thing, you always learn something from a relationship, I think, if you're reflecting on it and paying attention. But also, again, just every person is an image of God. And if you're just spending time with a person, getting to know a person, I don't think we should think that's a waste of time, ever, really. I mean, I think someone purposely dragging out a relationship, that's wasting their time and the other person's. There's a sense in which that's true. But I think if both people are genuinely still just considering, getting to know each other, discerning, it's not a waste of time. If it ends, that means your discernment was successful and came to the conclusion that you shouldn't marry each other. Mm-hmm. That was its purpose, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and that person is still someone you can pray for, someone you can love just as a brother or sister. Even if you're never going to talk to them again, there are plenty of times where it's not a great idea to stay in contact or whatever, but you can still love them in, a more spiritual way. And maybe there's still some reason that you were in their life for a while and they were in yours. And so I think the phrase waste of time should be used with great caution and very carefully. And we should be a little less fearful of leading someone on as long as our intentions are good and we're still, I guess I shouldn't say we anymore, but you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Everyone who is dating, I think should be a little bit more err on the side of giving someone a chance a little bit more until you have a definite important thing you can point to that you're like, this isn't going to work. And that definite important thing could just be a deep gut feeling that won't go away. I'm not discounting that. It doesn't have to be something super concrete, but it shouldn't be like, there's just, there's some things I don't know about them. I'm just, I'm not sure about this kind of thing. Like, okay, if you're not sure, then continue forward until you are sure.
It's a question mark.
Exactly.
Yeah. I liked what you said a second ago about like the whole job description idea, where because and this idea of objectification. I feel like as Catholics, sometimes we think we know the extent of what a sin is. It's almost like the 10 Commandments where like, oh, cool, I didn't kill anybody today, check number 5, right? But that encompasses within that commandment a ton of other things. Like, was I wrathful at somebody? Did I flip somebody off in traffic? There's a ton of other things underneath that. And so I feel like when we talk about objectification, use your imagination. Like, I'm sure someone can picture a context of like, yeah, this person is great for their body. As long as I'm not doing that, I'm fine. But reducing someone to a list of attributes. Right.
Or just what they can be for you, what they can do for you, how they can fulfill what you want in life. And I mean, you have to think about that. You have to think about your preferences and your goals in life and make sure they're aligning with the other person. But I think just over focus on that at the expense of just seeing them as a person first is a huge mistake. Especially because we don't always know what we're actually looking for, and we don't always know what type is going to be best for us,
Yeah. And that's the other thing too, is that openness. If you don't have that and you're only approaching dating with your own flawed, incomplete human knowledge, of course you're going to hit roadblocks. And of course you're going to hit obstacles because you're trying to discern who you should marry just based on like what your own mind can conceive. And would you say that God in his goodness gives peace when you're like with the right person? I feel like that has to be part of the equation. Like, what did you sort of find in your research?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. Peace is a little tricky because I think there are a lot of people who just tend toward anxiety and don't think that they ever have peace about anything. Not that I've ever been one of those people.
I was going to say, you can stop reading from my autobiography. That's first page, first sentence.
Oh, nice. Yeah, no, I would say I definitely struggle to know whether I have peace about something. And I know other people who have run into this too, where even when they were in a really great relationship that was headed toward marriage, I know at least one or two who were kind of still very hesitant to kind of take that step of getting engaged, or even during engagement kind of had some second thoughts like, oh no, maybe something's not right. But, and I struggled with some of that off and on, not to a point of like, I'm calling off the wedding, but just like, wonder if this really is the best decision. I wonder if even just my anxiety itself is a sign that I shouldn't be doing this or that. And I found that I think a lot of people do experience peace. And if you do, wonderful. I think that is a gift from God. If you feel like you just never really experience peace about things, then I think there's still other ways to kind of discern that. Like for me, I realized all the swirling anxieties were stuff I was just kind of imagining in my own head and weren't really reality. And when I went back to reality, and this is how I found, reflection and journaling, writing things down actually really helpful. When I went back to reality and looked at like, this is the way he actually treats me. This is what he's actually done for me. This is the fruit I've actually seen from this relationship so far. This is what other people think of our relationship who know us well and love us and want what's best for us. They can sort of affirm that it's good. All those things combined kind of brought me back to peace and kind of took away the anxiety. So yeah, I think there is peace, but it's
sometimes
maybe you have to look
for it.
Yeah, you got to look for some other things too to sort of like double check that maybe. But for those who are a little more anxious among us, yeah. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I liked the image of things just kind of swirling around upstairs, like in our own heads. And I know that I can get into that sometimes too. And I do think journaling is a really helpful practice of getting those things out from in between the ears onto a piece of paper, hopefully in adoration or like other time of prayer with Jesus to say like, here's what I'm thinking. Is this right?
And then you can go back, hopefully, to the things that actually did happen before and the piece you had before and reread that. Or if you're not a journaling person, I think everybody should have at least one like close friend or family member who knows you and the person you're dating well and has seen your relationship, who can hear everything about it and be trusted with that information and hear all of your anxieties and kind of point you back to like, this is what you were saying last week that sounded more true than what you're saying now. I had my friend like that who was wonderful and very helpful in kind of like the last few weeks before we ended up getting engaged. And I was having just a lot going on in my life and was, kind of stressed for that reason. And I think was kind of going, I don't know, like, is it really time? Is it this? Is it that? Should I be telling him, no, hold off? Like just, but it was all based on just like fear and random thoughts and not really reality. And she was able to kind of say, well, based on everything you've actually told me about this relationship and everything I've observed, it's actually really great. So I'm not sure where this fear is coming from, and just kind of gently nudging me back to like, if you have a fear that's for a reason, listen to that. But if your fear is just nonsensical, like maybe it's not from God and you shouldn't really listen to it, So whether it's a journal or a trusted person who's not going to go like spill all your secrets to someone else, right?
Of course.
That can be really, really helpful. And which kind of just taps again into the whole idea of having like good friendships around you and a good community around you as you embark on dating and discerning marriage. They can hopefully be trusted also to point out when it looks like you're not at peace and you're not happy in this relationship and it's draining the life out of you and it's not healthy. Or, my mom was a really helpful person in some of my past relationships to kind of gently say like, you make your own decisions, but I feel like he's not doing X, Y, Z that he really should be doing. Like what's going on here, and just kind of being a good gut check for me. So, moms are great for that if you if you have a mom in your life, but good friends can be good for that too. People who are going to really be honest with you and say, I want your happiness and this looks like it's not it,
Yeah, because they can bring that objective, like outside perspective as well, because I feel like it's harder to be objective when you're in it.
Definitely. Yeah. You tend to be attached. You tend to think of this person as your best friend and the person you talk to all the time and also have all those hopes for the future. You're already daydreaming potentially like, what are we going to name our kids or whatever? And it's so hard to let go all of that.
Where are we going to live? What kind of house are we going to buy?
Yeah. And it can be so humbling to realize that you were incorrect about this person if you were totally convinced that it was great and it was going to work out, right? So there's a lot of reasons why, when you're in something, it's very hard to see it objectively. There's actually a therapy method out there that some people might be familiar with. If maybe you've gone to a therapist who's done this for you or whatever, but I think it's called, okay, I shouldn't have even brought this up because I can't remember the name of it, but it's, the idea is like, I've had it explained to me, like, you set up the anxious thought or whatever it is, just like put it out there in front of you and pretend like it's on trial, and like call forward witnesses to like see if there's evidence for its case or evidence for your, for the opposite case, and just, prove it guilty or prove it innocent, basically. That's been a helpful image for me to kind of go like, okay, I don't have any evidence for this anxious thought, so I'm going to cast it aside. Yeah. It's guilty. It's gone.
It's guilty. It's yeah. It's in the slammer.
Right.
Okay. Now, I know I said that was my last question on anxiety, but I feel like there's one more that I want to ask here.
Maybe this is 2 episodes. That's fine.
that's all right. I love that process for processing something like a fear or an anxiety. Is there a point where trying to convict those anxieties becomes convincing yourself or talking yourself into something that maybe you shouldn't be part of? Is there, like, did you run into that at all in the research, or like, is there a point where giving someone a chance becomes like, I guess I really should, you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, I would say I ran into this some in my own experience, like years ago when I was kind of newer to dating. I was someone who tended to be kind of overthinking and kind of hyper intellectualize things when I was younger, like especially in college and studying philosophy and stuff. It kind of made me very like brainy about things rather than kind of listening to my emotions and my gut and my heart as well. And I think it's easy to go extreme one way or the other. Either just going with every little emotion and feeling and going, I feel a little anxious, so I'm going to call this whole thing off or whatever. Or I feel wonderful about this person the first time we met, so I'm just going to
marry this person.
Just go with it. Yeah, I'm sure we're going to get married. And then there's the opposite extreme of, I think, what you're talking about, where you kind of, maybe you have an icky feeling and you just keep going, well, I can't find any reason why I would have this icky feeling, like on and on and on and on and on. And the icky feeling's not going away. And you just sort of force yourself through with something anyway. And yeah, there's definitely a point where that becomes unhealthy. It's so hard to explain, I think, how to strike the balance. I guess I just sort of ended up figuring out my own way by like trial and error, like getting to know yourself ultimately and knowing like which icky feelings are actually that deep gut feeling that maybe God is using to speak to you. If that's a normal way he speaks to you, then like, yeah, you need to listen to it. But some feelings are just kind of
transient.
Yeah, transient, or like something that really isn't rooted in reality. I'm just going to go back to saying it's so helpful to have other people in your life who know you and the other person and who have really like seen your relationship. Because, I spoke, unfortunately, even with people who had been in like abusive relationships, and when they were in it, they couldn't see what was happening, right? Because you think that this is normal, or you think that, you couldn't possibly have gotten yourself into such a mess, so you're sort of ignoring it or whatever. And I think having other people who love you, who are also willing to be objective and say, do you have an anxious feeling? Because I'm seeing a problem that might be leading to that anxious feeling or whatever. And just having that conversation and bringing other people in. It's easy, I think, nowadays to think that our relationships are something very personal and it's just these two people, or even marriage is something very personal and just these people. But marriage is something public. It's an institution. It's a sacrament. It's something that you have to have witnesses for a reason. And if people have concerns about the fact that you are marrying this person, there's a chance for them to bring that up sort of as part of the process. And that's why you go to marriage prep with a priest or someone else who's been delegated to have that duty, who's supposed to be looking out for, like, is there something really, really wrong here?
Is there something off? Yeah.
Right. And so even before you get to that point, ideally, if there's something really off, like, you should have other people in your life to kind of help you figure that out. I don't know. This is kind of a topic I'm kind of passionate about. I think we need to recover a sense of not talking too much about someone that maybe we've just gone out on a date or two with, because then it ruins their chance to like truly start fresh with somebody else if the relationship doesn't end up working out. And there's, gossip is a real problem that's definitely pointed to in the catechism as like, you should be, generally cognizant of somebody else's reputation being really important. But then also as you're getting deeper into relationship, you definitely need to have those people around you to kind of help shed light on it. So I think it's a really good policy, again, to have like one or two either family members or close, very close, like very trusted friends that you're really telling everything to. And then everybody else, you keep it more on the level of, you know, just like maybe you go as far as to say like, we're having some struggles in this relationship, but maybe you're not going to go into details, or like, even if you break up, maybe it's not appropriate to say like, here's exactly why this relationship ended. But instead just say like, wonderful person, it just didn't work out. We weren't a good fit. You know, I think it's totally fine to leave it on that level with majority of people around you because, or who are also in the dating world, because you want that person and yourself to like have a fresh start with the next person.
Yeah.
But I think if you have a good married friend, that's the ideal, because they're totally out of the dating pool. There's no danger of it like causing an issue, and you can just go to them with everything and say like, here's what's really going on. And then maybe they have better insight because they've already been through it themselves and they're married.
I was going to say,
you know?
yeah, I think that last point in particular is really special, because why it's sort of like, you know, that old saying, like, don't take advice from someone on how to do something if they haven't done it themselves.
Yes.
Like,
my brother says this all the time.
Yeah.
You're the brother you know well.
Thomas?
Yeah. He likes to be like, I don't take workout advice from fat people. I don't take dating advice from single people. And I'm like, amen, brother. Like, yeah.
I can totally hear him saying that.
Which I'm very grateful that the way God worked it out, like I was engaged for most of writing this book and married by the time it came out. Otherwise, I mean, it would have been a very different book if I was still just single and dating myself. It's kind of an in the trenches book either way. But yeah, I think I learned a lot from actually, you know, going through the whole experience myself. And yeah, I'm really excited to kind of share all of it while the woes of dating is still kind of fresh in my mind too, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
because just being a person who's going through it myself and hadn't succeeded, I think I would have just had to like lean so much more on the experts, you know, even more than I already did.
I hear people say that dating is difficult.
Yeah, and I hear people say that this is what works and this is what, you know, how to have a happy marriage, but I don't really know. Yeah,
that's really funny. Yeah, I really do love the idea though of like protecting reputations. And it's and I feel like that kind of comes back to the anxiety thing as well, where it's really easy to imagine how something blowing up could turn into, well, I'm never gonna have friends again because this thing blew up.
Much less being able to date anybody else in this town, and I just have to move somewhere and start over with a new name. And
right, exactly. And that is something that needs to get out in journaling and be like, listen, you have people who, well, is there any evidence for that? You have people who love you and like care about you and all that stuff. Yeah. And I also really like the balance between, like, because I could see how there's the two extremes of sharing what's happening in the relationship with people that you care about. On one hand, you share nothing and then you get no insight, and you're sort of blinded or clouded by what's happening in the relationship and like your hopes and your fears for the relationship, and you can't make as effective decisions. Versus if you tell everybody, then that can damage your reputation as like a gossip. It could damage the other person's reputation. And so I think striking that balance, like you said, is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. Like choose your one or two people that you're really going to confide in. And I think that's probably sufficient as long as those one or two people are good people who want what's best for you and who actually know what's going on. Yeah. I also think, if you don't mind, I want to kind of circle back to the topic of that sort of non-exclusive method of dating in the early stage. Something that actually the experts I talked to somewhat disagreed on was whether or not you need to tell the people you're dating that you're also dating other people during that stage. Because on the one hand, there was at least one expert who basically said, like, well, you want to make each person feel special. You want to make each person feel like they're kind of the only person in the world. You don't want to like squelch the initial sparks of possible romance by being like, yeah, and I have another date tomorrow, you know? But then on the other hand, I heard people who said, it's just kind of part of being honest and setting expectations and letting people know like what level of commitment you're at. It was better to go ahead and share that that you are also seeing other people. And I think it probably really depends on the situation. Because again, you kind of want to strike that balance of not just like naming names and telling everybody, like, you definitely don't want to like tell one person you're dating, like, yeah, I'm also seeing so-and-so who's your best friend, and I'm also talking to this guy online, and I'm also like, you don't want to just like have a number and everything, you know, about those people, because that could cause a lot of problems.
Right.
But and definitely make people feel like they're just like directly pitted against each other in a competition or something, which could be really unhealthy. But I also, ultimately, I kind of landed on the side of, I think it's better to signal that you're seeing an undetermined number of other people who shall remain nameless, you know, if you're doing that, because that way, yeah, it just seems so much, it seems more honest. It seems like you're setting the expectation appropriately, that like, you're not going to be 0 to 60. Like, this is something that, like, if you end up in a relationship, it's going to be kind of easing in, and lowers the pressure, I think, for the other person too. They kind of go, okay, that means we have some time here to kind of consider. I think, yeah. So if you're going that route, if you end up seeing more than one person, the way I sort of did it was, if the first like date or two went well, and we were going to go on another one, I would say something like, really enjoyed time with you so far. I just want to let you know that, like, I'm not rushing into an exclusive relationship right now. I'm kind of getting to know some other people. If you're okay with that, I'd love to just continue, you know? And like, most people seem pretty fine with that if it's laid out that way. And I think maybe being a guy to the girl, like, you'd want to maybe be even more cautious with it. I don't know. Girls are very sensitive, like, to the sense of competition, but keeping it focused on her and being like, I don't want to pressure you into like being exclusive right away. I really just want to like continue taking it one day at a time and just getting to know you a little bit better, and, you know, or something like that, you know, I think can be really helpful. So like, you're communicating enough, but also not being like, here's a list of everybody I've been on dates with lately, you know, especially in a community where like all the Catholics know each other. So I think a situation where maybe you don't have to share so much or not at all is like, you're going out with two totally different people you met on the internet who maybe even live in different places and would have no reason to run into each other. It's like, again, my sense, I've actually never done online dating myself. My sense is like, everybody on an app kind of knows that like, you're probably talking to other people and it's not a big deal. Whereas in person, where those people might bump into each other, like at church or at an event or something, might even know each other and might be talking to each other about their dating journeys. You want to be a little bit more honest, and yet not be sharing too much at the same time. So, yeah. So thanks for letting me like delve into that, I'm a little passionate about, but I think it ties in.
That I think is a really effective soapbox. It's setting, and you've used this word a couple of times, that word pace, where I feel like you said, that framing up front of, hey, I enjoy time with you. Like, I've enjoyed this date. And at the same time, like, I'm also getting to know a few other people over here. It sets this context for like, because if you didn't do that, then that other person might have the expectation that things are going to become more serious, and it might be a quicker slope,
right,
as opposed to where you actually are.
Yeah. And that's one among the many things, like we touched on earlier, that people just don't come in with the same expectations. You can't assume that someone dates in the same way you do, you know, even if you're both Catholic and you think you have like the same basic values and moral compass, there's a lot of different things that will come up. So yeah, I think finding even like scripting it for yourself and practice running it beforehand, like finding a way to say these things in a way that's not too confrontational, and it's not like, let me just bare my whole soul and life story to you and like hash this all out on our first date or something, you know, like you want to still keep it fun and lighthearted and focused on like just getting to know each other and not dig into all the serious topics right away, but finding a way to, communicating well and setting expectations, and asking questions too. I think it's always like, just better safe than sorry if you're in doubt about how somebody sees this phase of a relationship or how something should go or what their expectation is. Like, are we supposed to kiss at the end of our first date, or are we not supposed to do that because, you know, or whatever, like anything. It's always better to just kind of ask in the moment, like, can we do this? What do you think about that? Would you mind if I, whatever, you know, and just, everything just has to be said out loud sometimes, even if it feels a little awkward. It's usually much less awkward to communicate than to not communicate, I find. Yeah,
I totally agree with you. And it's shocking how quickly, and just the damage and the hurt that can happen when things aren't communicated.
Yeah.
And in that moment of transparency. And I know that I've been in those sorts of moments where there's something that's either off or like something that I feel like needs to be said. And I feel like the hesitation comes from like, well, I don't want to lose this person, you know, just
back
by
to
sort of
kind of the scarcity mindset almost, or the sense of like having to cling to something.
Yeah.
Well, and I've had occasion to say this to a friend or two before, where they were running into like, this person I've gone on a few dates with has a very different idea of the pace of the relationship or how things should go. And I always would say, if you can't agree on even what the next step of your relationship should look like or how dating should work, probably it's not going to work out ultimately anyway, because there's probably lots of other things you aren't, you know, if neither person is willing to be flexible or just communicate well about this and figure out a way to move forward, then it's not going to work, you know? So it's better to be, to just figure that out, you know,
up front.
Yeah. In the sense that like, I think a major conflict in how dating should go might just signal like deeper, attitudes toward relationships that, you know, even if you get over this hurdle, like you might run into
other ones,
something else. Like if you get over this hurdle by just letting go of your own way of looking at it completely, not just compromising, but like being like, oh, well, I'll just do what the other person thinks we should do. Then, you know, you're just going to run into something else later probably. And that's not, it doesn't set a good precedent to just like let go of all your ideas and your boundaries. Sorry if I'm being a little bit vague, but I think like, I don't want to put people back into that, like, this is a waste of time, I should just get all the deal breakers out there in the open on the first date mindset. Yeah. Like, you know, but as sort of, like as you progress through those first few dates, like the concept of like when, you know, if we're going to become boyfriend and girlfriend officially and start doing things like meeting each other's families or whatever, like when do you think that should happen? If it happens, I think those conversations should sort of start to come up in the first like month or two. And yeah, I mean, like I said, the whole idea of having a non-exclusive stage is very controversial. I don't want to force anybody to do it, but like whether you're going to do it or not do it, that's maybe one of the first things that should be talked about, and you know, get a sense of what the other person would like to do or what they believe on that.
Timing and expectations for certain, like, I guess thresholds maybe could be a word for it.
Yeah. Or like even just whether, like how long that initial phase should last, and what do even the words boyfriend and girlfriend mean, you know, much less like when would we move to that stage. But also, I mean, I interviewed some people who pointed out that even those words don't necessarily mean the same thing to different people. Those words are kind of vague. So if you're becoming official, becoming boyfriend and girlfriend, becoming exclusive, whatever term you want to use, you have to also, alongside that, have a whole conversation about what does this mean? You know, what does this mean? Okay, it should mean, I think, like we're actively discerning marriage only with each other. We're really considering that. We see potential there. Okay, but what does discerning marriage mean? What are the things that we might start to do? For us, for me and Enrique, it was pretty clear to both of us that like meeting each other's parents and families and letting our families even start getting to know each other was important to both of us once we moved into that stage. So that was a big part of it. Other people might have other specific things. If you're long distance, for example, does it mean that you're going to try to visit each other on a certain cadence or whatever? Like just, everything has to be said out loud. And even defining things like, well, if I'm your boyfriend or I'm your girlfriend, like what does that mean to you? You know, before I agree to that, what is your expectation?
Terms and conditions.
A little bit, but nicer than that. Yeah.
Have you heard people say that when you're with somebody and it's like, and it's right, it should be easy to be with them?
Yes, that was an interesting thing that came up. I was luckily connected to a couple of Catholic psychologists, interviewed at least one for the book, and then there was another who just gave me access to an online course he has. His name is Dr. Mario Sacasa, and his course is called Dating Well. Okay. And it's kind of a pun. It's like the image is a well, like like a well, like a water well, and then but it's also about dating in a good way. So it was very informative. And one of the things he says in that course is that he has this analogy of like, I think his son who's happens to be just really, really good at baseball, but also like puts in the work to practice and get better and better. And he said a good relationship shouldn't be constant tension. It shouldn't be constant arguments. It shouldn't be just so difficult all the time. You shouldn't be like force marching your way through it. There should be a certain ease and joy and peace and happiness and fun that's happening. And yeah, most of your day-to-day should flow pretty easily if it's a good relationship. But every now and then you are going to run into something that you're going to have to work through. And seeing how you work through those difficulties is a big part of it too. You know, can you in some sense argue well or disagree well and respectfully or not is really important. So it's okay when those conflicts come up, but it shouldn't be constant. Even if you're having really healthy conflict, but it's every day, that's probably a problem, you know? And so, yeah, he said like, there's this ease and joy in his son when he plays baseball, but there's also like, he had to practice some to get to that point where there's ease and joy, but even the practice was a joy because he likes it so much, and overall it was coming pretty quickly to him. And so I think that's a really good analogy that I'm just going to swipe from him.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I like that. And I think it strikes because I think folks can fall into that sort of trap of, well, this is difficult, therefore it's not right.
I'll just run away. And then there's the opposite trap that I would say I fell into probably once or twice in the past. I think some of us more, maybe I almost want to say scrupulous leaning people might fall into, where we've been told relationships take work, marriage is hard, relationships are hard. And so we emphasize that so much, and we think, well, I shouldn't break up with this person just because it's a little hard. Relationships take work. And so I think it's important, again, to just strike a balance and realize like it's going to take some work, but that there should also be a lot of joy. There should be a lot of reward for that work. You know, it shouldn't just be work all the time, because that's what the rest of your life is going to be like if you marry that person. You know, the best predictor of the future is the past and the present, right? And I say in the book, if your current dating relationship is making you happier and holier, then that's a good sign that like if you marry this person, you're probably going to keep being happier and holier, and that's a good thing. But if your current relationship is not making you happier and holier, then there's no reason to move forward. That's a pretty clear sign. You know, if you're seeing a consistent theme of just unhappiness and difficulties all the time. Again, sometimes we grab crosses that the Lord didn't mean to give us, you know.
That's right.
There's going to be crosses also.
Go ahead.
Sorry. My spiritual director has some really beautiful insights on this. She was married for several decades, and her husband has since passed on, but she always talks about their whole relationship, their marriage just being so beautiful and so wonderful. And she's honestly probably the only person who's ever told me, my marriage wasn't hard. Marriage doesn't have to be hard. And it wasn't that life was just easy and puppies and rainbows all the time. She's very clear that they encountered suffering, but they encountered suffering together. So life was hard for them. You know, he had a terrible illness. They had some really difficult struggles with losing miscarriage and things like that. And life was really hard, but they were going through those sufferings together and together with God. And so they both had a really good relationship with God. They had a good relationship with each other. And so she always said, like, all those difficulties are sort of external to our relationship, which always stayed good and stayed healthy. And so she just kept reminding me, like, over and over, you know, as I was dating Enrique and during engagement, she was like, don't be, I guess, like, fearful of marriage, that like it has to be just cross all the time. Like, you know, you're gonna encounter difficulties in life, but your marriage doesn't have to be a difficulty in itself. People will even say things, you know, kind of these funny phrases like, take up your spouse and follow me. I've heard that one. I don't know if you've ever heard that one. Oh my
goodness, wow.
And maybe it's a joke, or maybe, I mean, I think they're trying to get to a real point. Like, if you are already married, like validly married in the church, and your spouse becomes a great cross to you, unfortunately, then like, yeah, that's something that God is going to get you through. And the grace of the sacrament is supposed to like help you get through that. And there's hope for your relationship to become better over time. And, you know, lots of great resources for improving marriages that are kind of on the rocks. So yeah, like once you're in it, once you have the cross already, you've got to bear it. But like, if you're just dating someone, I think sometimes, yeah, there's this temptation to go one extreme or the other, either just like flee from any difficulty, like you said, and end up being fearful of commitment, never getting into anything at all. Or, you know, what I honestly, I kept running into this was clinging to this heavy cross that just wasn't necessarily supposed to be for that person, and thinking this is normal because this is what marriage is going to look like.
That's the narrative that's
sort of
pushed
there's a
sometimes.
lot of emphasis on marriage being hard. I think in Catholicism and in the generation or two before us, I think has often promoted that message. I think, again, I don't want to badmouth them. I think it's all with good intentions because they saw that like divorce was rampant and people tend to get divorced at every, little difficulty in sort of the broader world. And so that message is good in the sense that it says like, you shouldn't think that like just because something's imperfect you need to get rid of this spouse, that's a call to go deeper and improve your relationship. But I think people translate that backward like too far into the earlier stages of dating and think I have to just push through because this is good practice for marriage. And sometimes you don't have to push through. It's like you should at least have a honeymoon phase that should last at least through your actual honeymoon, I think, and not just be over by the time you're engaged or something.
Yeah, and I feel like coming back to a point that we touched on earlier, I feel like this whole idea of kind of pushing, even though it's like really, really difficult and maybe an indicator of not being a good fit. I feel like even that ties back into like the idea of God's goodness as well, because I feel like if God is good, I don't think he would send you a person that is exclusively a cross.
Right. Yeah, not at all. I mean, it's supposed to be an image of Christ in the church. Marriage is supposed to be an image of Christ in the church. We're told that heaven is a wedding feast. So marriage is supposed to be happy. It's supposed to be joyful, right? Yeah. And that means a relationship that's headed toward marriage, you should see it as a total green flag if it's mostly smooth sailing and then you just have a little healthy disagreement once in a while. That's totally normal. I mean, another thing my spiritual director has said, she was like, you don't ever really have to have a fight. A lot of people think that having a fight every now and then in their marriage or in their relationship is normal. A fight in the sense of like screaming and yelling, and getting really nasty with each other and storming off to your corner. She's like, sure, like, if it happens, you resolve it, apologize, forgive, et cetera. Maybe some people's tempers are just maybe more prone to that, but it's not necessary and it doesn't have to be normal. You can have conflict and disagreement in a much more calm and respectful way where, you both should go into it with the goal of like, just finding the truth, finding the best solution, finding the ideal for both of you, right? And certainly, if you're not even married yet, like, I think it's just good to keep in mind that you're not married till you're married, and every stage of the relationship before that, you don't have the same level of duty to that person to stay with that person as you do if you're married. I think every stage, that duty sort of starts to increase. Like, if you've gotten engaged, hopefully you've done your discernment really well and you're not going to call it off for just some flimsy reason. Like, like you should take it, you should be erring a little more on the side of going through with getting married, unless there's a really serious problem at that point. Right. But if you're, just starting to date somebody, or you've just been dating for like 6 months, you're not engaged yet or whatever, like your level of commitment, your level of duty is proportional to your commitment, and the level of hardship you are should be, I think, willing to go through and work your way through for this person should also be sort of proportionate to the commitment level.
The stage that you're at in the relationship dictates how much suffering is appropriate to endure for the sake of keeping the relationship together, how much conflict is appropriate to endure for the sake of keeping the relationship together. And that increases over time. So in the event that you get into a conflict with your spouse, hey, you're in the sacrament now, and you got to work it out. You have to. A friend of mine used this, and like this, I think I'm recognizing this in myself as we're talking about this. I know that I have some of that older generation's mindset of just like marriage is hard. Like the metaphor that my friend has used for me before is like marriage is sort of like being in the cargo hold of an airplane. And it's you and one other person, and you need to sort of like figure out how to get along with this person. And then divorce is like, okay, well, this isn't working. I'm just like bailing out of the airplane. Wow. Which is kind of a dismal, because it's not a great place to be. That sounds awful
either way.
That sounds so great. Yeah. So, but
yeah. Oh man, that's wow. Yeah. I don't know. I'm not sure where this whole thing, all these dismal sort of images came from. Again, I have to assume it was all well-intentioned initially. And, I think what I kind of initially said when I started writing on this topic, wrote an article for Catholic World Report about a year ago where I mentioned this, that like one of the reasons I think why some people in the Catholic world might be a little fearful of marriage or just not really prioritizing it highly is because maybe all they've ever heard is marriage is hard, parenthood is hard, everything's really hard. And especially if, unfortunately, their own parents didn't have the greatest relationship. When I took an anonymous survey of a few hundred people, one of the questions I asked was, what was your own parents' relationship like? And unfortunately, a very high number, much higher than I would have expected, a large number of people said their parents stayed together, they weren't divorced, but they seemed very unhappy. And so I think a lot of people, for whatever reason, have seen some really unhappy marriages, or at least marriages where the joy wasn't displayed to their children. But maybe it was there, but it wasn't really displayed. The appearance was that they were unhappy, even if they weren't actually literally divorced. They were kind of emotionally divorced or constantly arguing. And then they were told, like, marriage is hard, marriage is a cross, you just have to get through it. And so, I mean, thinking of it that way, why would we do this? Why would we ever want to do that? Versus thinking God made marriage to be a gift to us. He made it to be something really joyful. He uses it as an analogy for like his love for us all the time. It's a very good thing. And then yes, hardships also come because we live in a fallen world, but it's totally worth it. So what I ended up saying was, it's not that the message marriage is hard or life is hard or marriage takes work. It's not that those messages are exactly wrong. I think they're just incomplete. We need to hear marriage is kind of hard, but it's totally worth it. Or, marriage brings a lot of crosses, but it also brings a lot of joys. There's a beautiful, beautiful part in the, stop me if I'm going on too long, by the way.
This is great. You're great. You're doing great.
Yes. There's a beautiful portion of the traditional Latin wedding mass that I've always loved. This part is said in English, so it's easy to hear. So I've heard it many times now. Luckily, I've been blessed to go to many weddings and then my own not long ago. But at the beginning, actually, right before the couple like says their vows and everything, the priest reads this exhortation. It's kind of like a little homily that's just already built into the missal that he reads every time. And there's a part where it talks about sacrifice, and it says something like, sacrifice is usually considered difficult and irksome, but love can make it easier, and true love can make it a joy. And that just has really sat with me the last couple of years, because there's a saying that as the church prays, so she believes. So if something has been written into the liturgy for centuries, it's something that the church believes and is promoting as true. And so I think it's very clear that the church's actual, real, traditional, longstanding teaching is that, yes, marriage involves sacrifice, but sacrifice combined with love is actually a joy. So the hard, hearing marriage is hard. I think what we're actually supposed to take from that is that marriage requires sacrifice. Yes, you have to die to yourself. Yes, you have to be flexible on things. Yes, you're going to disagree on what are we eating for dinner tonight, or what, anything from that to something really big, like where are we sending the kids to school? Like, you're going to run into things that are difficult. But if you actually love this person truly, and you have the grace of the sacrament and God's love backing that up, being able to die to yourself and say, you know what, I'm going to let you have this one. Actually, yes, you're right. Let's do what you think, because I think that's actually better. Like, being able to sacrifice your own will or desires sometimes in an appropriate way can actually be such a joy and such a gift. I've already found in just being married for a month that like doing little things around the house that I used to think of as like really boring chores, like, oh, I don't want to do the dishes or whatever, feels like much more of a joy now, because I'm not just doing it for me. I'm also doing it for someone else. Right. And then sometimes he does things for me and I'm just delighted with that. And so it's like, we're just kind of this constant back and forth of giving these things to each other. And yeah, I guess those things are a sacrifice in the sense that they're not necessarily super fun to do in themselves, but it almost doesn't feel like a sacrifice. Like, it doesn't feel burdensome because, again, when you love someone, it's a joy to do something for them, right? I think that's an idea I'd really like to just spread around more and kind of leave people with. If they take nothing else away from the book or from this conversation, I would say, that's this theme that the church has given us, that marriage, and by extension, dating, can be really hard. It can involve sacrifice, but it's totally, totally worth it. And that that sacrifice should also bring joy with it. Joy is a fruit of the Holy Spirit. So if you're constantly, quote unquote, sacrificing for somebody in your dating relationship and it's always just burdensome, and you're not getting any joy, like that's a sign that like the Holy Spirit is not bringing good fruit out of this. At some point you have to just call it quits and say something's not right here. But if you're sacrificing in a more, healthy way and the other person's also sacrificing for you and there's a lot of joy in it, that's a really good sign. That's a green flag. So yeah.
That balance and those indicators. Rachel Hoover, Canto, Pretty Good Catholic. It's out February 28th, right?
It is actually being printed as we speak. So the publisher should be shipping me copies very soon. Anyone who's pre-ordered it should actually be getting it before the end of February. So
okay, awesome.
Yeah, so right now you can go to prettygoodcatholic.com. That should redirect you to the right page on the publisher's website, and you can pre-order it right now, and it'll come hopefully in time for Valentine's Day. Actually, that was the goal, of getting it out there in time for St. Valentine, which is also Ash Wednesday this year. So, doom and gloom and ashes. Remember your death, everyone. But,
that's right.
But until then, date well.
That's right. Oh my gosh. And then you'll be at St. Mary's Bookstore on West End.
Yes, on Saturday the 24th, 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. I'll be signing books down
Signing copies. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for your time. Any last thoughts that you want to leave?
No, I think we went deep on lots of different topics. Surprisingly, though, we still didn't touch on everything that's in this book. It was a big project to write it. So I hope everyone who's interested will grab a copy and read it. And I would love for, I'm assuming you have some local Nashville listeners, or even people around the country. If I'm running into anybody who's read the book, I welcome discussion and feedback, especially on anything that's kind of controversial. I'm still learning a lot myself. So spicy takes are welcome and feedback. And I would love to hear if anybody reads something that they found really helpful, and especially if it's changed your dating mindset in some way. I just want to say again, like a lot of the advice that I was giving in the book is stuff that I learned either during writing it, from the experts and then put into practice, and it was really helpful, or something that I kind of learned by trial and error. But everything in there pretty much is something that I have at least a little experience with and found to work really well. And so, I went from single to married sort of in the course of studying this topic and learning about it. And so, I don't know, the publisher likes to say she took her own advice and that's why she's married now. And I think it's largely true. So
what you're saying is
some hope. Yeah.
You're guaranteeing that people will get married after reading this book is what I'm hearing, right?
No, we won't go that far. Other people and God are also involved. But
Gotcha.
But
results may vary.
But I would love to hear people's stories, whether they tried something I said and it utterly miserably failed, or whether they tried it and it was a happy ending.
That's fantastic. And we'll make sure to include a link to Rachel's website in the description. Pretty Good Catholic. Pick up your copy today. And thank you, Rachel, so much for being part of this.
Thank you so much for having me.